Okay, how about we get started? Welcome. If I haven't met you, my name is Mike. Welcome to week 2 of Words of Delight, our class here on the Bible as literature. So if you weren't here last week, then we talked about kind of an overview of how do we enjoy the Bible and what kind of literature is the Bible, and we gave you some homework. So it's homework for this whole class, these 4 weeks, and this is your homework. Read the Bible in a new way for these 4 weeks. So we talked about listening to an audio Bible. We talked about reading the Bible in a new translation or starting a new reading plan for the Bible or something like that. And so let's kick this off by turning to someone around you or a small group of people and ask each other this question: how did it go reading the Bible in a new way this week? Or if this is your first week here, you missed the first week, maybe talk about what's a new way that I might want to read the Bible this week. So take a couple of minutes and talk about that. A children's Bible. Awesome. I love it. So today we are talking about biblical narrative, one of the most universal human impulses is to tell somebody, hey, tell me a story. It's to ask for a story. Human beings have been telling stories since we were first created. It's woven into our bones. And the Bible satisfies that human instinct because while there are laws and letters and poems in the Bible, more than half of the Bible is narrative. And at its core, the Bible is a story. So, one more group discussion question. Turn to somebody around you. Ask them, what's your favorite story? Book, movie, TV show, what's your favorite story and why is it your favorite story? What makes it your favorite? Go. All right. So tonight we are talking about biblical narrative. More than half of the Bible is made up of narrative, of story. And like any kind of story, it has unique features. So The Lord of the Rings, my favorite story, was written in the 1940s and published in the 1950s, is very characteristic of its British author and its British setting, and the setting of the World War II is just past. The Bible was written in a specific context, in a specific way. And so under this biblical narrative overview section, I've put space for you to write down 4 features of narrative in the Bible with examples. So the first one that we're going to talk about is realism. Realism is the first feature of biblical narrative. So biblical storytellers spend a lot of energy placing their stories in space-time history. For example, look at how the character of Abraham is introduced in Genesis 12, 5 and 6. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Now, we don't typically tell stories in this way, but it reads more like entries in a diary or a biography. And it clues you in that if you wanted to, you could trace where Abram and his family are going on a map. It's grounded in factual basis. The Bible is also realistic literature in that it is concrete and vivid and specific, perhaps even more specific and vivid than we would want. Here's the story of Ehud from Judges 3. And Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh and thrust it into his belly. That's the king. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly. And the dung came out. Then Ehud went out onto the porch and closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. It's like a movie. You can visualize every single moment in there, even though you don't want to. And so the biblical stories sometimes zoom in on these earthy, gritty details. Also, biblical narrative is realistic because it has unidealized human behavior. The Bible is not willing to put characters on a pedestal, but it shows us all of their warts. One biblical scholar wrote a commentary on Genesis, and he said that these characters in Genesis are so deeply flawed that they have almost more shadow than light. There's actually only a handful of characters in the Bible that have no obvious flaws. I put Joseph up there with a maybe, because he's kind of a brat to his brothers, so it could be argued he's got some lack of wisdom there, at least at the beginning. You have Ruth, who you only meet for a very short time. We're not told any of her flaws. That's not to say she was actually sinless. You have the character of Daniel, same thing. You don't see him for very long. And then you have, of course, Jesus. But basically every other biblical character that you see has flaws, put very much on display. It is realistic literature. The Bible is also realistic literature because it focuses on common experiences and average social standing. Have you ever noticed how many names there are in the Bible? There are way more names than we feel like would be necessary. For example, in 1 Chronicles 9, there's a long list of everyone who worked in the temple in Jerusalem under David, including verses 30 and 31, others of the sons of the priests prepared the mixing of the spices, and Mittahiah, one of the Levites, the firstborn of Shallum the Korahite, was entrusted with making the flat cakes. What other religious book includes the detail of the person who prepared the food for the priests? And then there was Marge, and she baked a casserole for the potluck, or a hot dish, I suppose you would say if I was contextualizing here. The Bible contains stories and names and lists of ordinary people. It names the Hebrew midwives in the Exodus story who opposed Pharaoh. Contrast this to, for example, the epics of Homer, like the Odyssey and the Iliad, where only the aristocrats, the important people, are named, and then people of lesser standing are just the nameless crew behind them who do no great deeds. One last thing that makes it realistic literature is its brevity and plain style. The biblical authors tend to give us only the essentials, and they leave much unstated. We're going to talk about this more. We talked about it a little bit last week when we talked about meditation literature, how the details are sparse but subtle. So there's very little we know about motives or inner thoughts of characters. For example, what was Moses thinking about? Or what was his plan when he killed the Egyptian? Was it justice, or did he have a fit of temper? What was going on in his mind? And a modern novel would tell you, and as Moses raised the club, he was thinking about, and so on and so forth. But we don't get that in the biblical narrative. We're going to talk about why in a moment. But that's realism. The second feature of biblical narrative is its opposite, romance. I don't mean like romance like we use the word. I mean a story that delights in the extraordinary and the miraculous. Stories that are full of mystery and the supernatural. I think of the beginning of the Princess Bride movie where the little boy is skeptical about the grandpa telling him a story, and the grandpa goes, "Oh no, you gotta hear this story. There's adventures and pirates." And you remember that scene? That's what the Bible is like. There's adventure and rescue and surprise and battle and poetic justice. The underdog wins. The villain gets his punishment. There's happy ever afters. Here's what Leland Reichend writes about the Bible. He wrote this: "The Bible's resemblance to this type of story is obvious. Its stories are filled with adventure, marvelous events, battles of many kinds, danger, supernatural characters, villains who get what they deserve, witches, heroes and heroines, an occasional talking animal, dragons, dungeons, castles, giants, quests, shipwrecks, captures and rescues, kings and queens, romantic loves, and a few boy heroes." Bible stories, moreover, tend to be happy ending stories in which good characters win and the bad ones lose. The Bible is also romantic literature, and then it sometimes describes events with an almost exalted or elevated poetic style with artistry. So just listen here as I read the story of the Red Sea, crossing the Red Sea in Exodus 14. Just hear the drama of this. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, and so on and so forth. It's no wonder why the stories of the Bible are so appealing to children, right? I loved playing David and Goliath with my dad, where, I'm 5 years old and I'm on the bed and I'm defeating Goliath because he's so much bigger than me. And yet, at the same time, the Bible is an R-rated book, right? It deals with every kind of adult theme that we can imagine. And so here's the important message of romance. We are in a supernatural world, the Bible says. Yes, we're in a mundane, ordinary reality, and sometimes the Bible will kind of dial up the realism factor, like the story of Ruth. There's no miracles or crossing the Red Sea in the story of Ruth. It's just an ordinary story. But then at other times, the Bible will dial up the romance factor, like in crossing the Red Sea, and whoa, this is adventure literature. And so I just want to pause here and notice with these two characteristics, what this does for us, what it invites us to do. The Bible is both factually realistic and romantically marvelous. There is reason and imagination. There is fact and there is mystery. There's sophistication and there's naivete. And so, how should we read the Bible? I think it invites us to a double response. We're supposed to lose ourselves in the story, just be absorbed in the action. And we're also supposed to carefully analyze its artistry and its composition. So, we've got realism, we've got romance. What else do we got? Tragedy. And by tragedy, I mean the downward movement of a plot from positive to negative, usually caused by a character's great mistake. So think Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet or so on and so forth. Tragedies focus on the destructive potential of evil in human beings. Tragedies are descent stories. They make us think about what ruins us. And the Bible deals with questions of suffering, justice, life and death, oppression, and evil. Here's just a few examples from the first half of the Bible. And it's only a few because they're all over. There's the fall in Genesis 3. There's Cain in Genesis 4. There's Israel in Exodus 32. That's the golden calf incident. There's Korah in the book of Numbers. One of the longest and most complex tragedies in the Bible is the story of Samson in Judges 13 to 16. He gets all those chapters as you see his downfall. You have Saul and David and Solomon and all the kings. Even Jesus' parables often have tragic elements in them. There's the nice parables in there, but then you also have the slothful servant, the unforgiving servant. There's the elder brother in the prodigal son story where it ends on a down note, on a warning. Now, I want to make a distinction here. Many people have understood that there is a distinction between biblical tragedy and Greek tragedy, like the story of Oedipus or those sorts of things. Now, in Greek tragedy, the ways of the gods are mysterious, and the heroes make their tragic choices without full awareness of the issues that are involved. And so they come to a wrong decision, and trouble comes to them because of that. But in the Bible, the enemy is within, and tragedy doesn't come upon you because you made an accidental choice. The ways of God are known, and the tragic characters in the Bible are tragic because they know what God says, and they choose to disobey him anyway. That is the tragedy. The tragedy is that we know God and his ways, but we choose to go our own way. I put this great quote from W.H. Auden. He said, "Greek tragedy is the tragedy of necessity. The feeling aroused in the spectator is, what a pity it had to be this way. Christian tragedy is the tragedy of possibility. What a pity it was this way when it might have been otherwise." When it might have been otherwise. Now, what's the opposite of tragedy? Comedy. Comedy. We're not speaking of humor at the moment, although we'll get to it, but I'm talking about comedy in the U-shaped arc, where you move from sorrow to joy. Comedies are ascent stories. The protagonist needs to overcome challenges in order to be transformed. So, for example, you have the story of Joseph. He was betrayed, enslaved, imprisoned, and then all of a sudden he's exalted and his family is restored and he gets to be reunited and surrounded by his family and see his father again. It's a comedy story. Or think of Ruth. Starts with famine and widowhood, vulnerability, poverty. And then she gets married and she has a birth. And then there's that sweet twist at the end of the story when you find out that Ruth was, her descendant was David. So she's in the line of the king. So this is key. You have this interplay. Sometimes the tragedy dial is turned up. Sometimes the comedy dial is turned up. Sometimes the realism dial is turned up. Sometimes the romance. I do, though, want to take this opportunity to talk about humor itself. Sometimes I hear this idea that the Bible is without humor. But the Bible, as we've said, is about real life. And so it's also about the funny things in life. Here are 5 different kinds of humor that I think are in the Bible. First, situational comedies, sitcoms, which has surprises and oddness and sudden reversals. And like, how did we find ourselves in this situation? For example, Balaam talks to a donkey who tells him, hey, don't go this way. The donkey suddenly, instead of this, mystical prophet-like character, the donkey is the one who says, don't you see the angel right in front of you? Or you have Ehud and King Eglon, the story that we read earlier. And you're meant to kind of laugh at the details that are in, like, how ridiculous is this? There's actually a sitcom being made right now called The Promised Land. You can find it on YouTube. And it's a sitcom, like a cross between The Office and the Exodus story. And it works really, really well because there is so much humor in the Exodus story when the Israelites are wandering the desert and they're like, why do we have to sacrifice the goats? One of my favorite jokes is that some of the characters are taking a test on the Torah that God has given them. And then there's Korah there who gets 99 out of 100 right. And he says, which one did I get wrong? And Moses says, now let me ask the class. Should you give your kids as a sacrifice to Molech? And the whole class goes, no. And Korah goes, I missed that one. There's situational comedy in the Bible. Humor from characters, often satiric. Peter's impulsiveness, where, for example, he sees the glory of Jesus in the transfiguration. And he goes, Jesus, we should make some tents here or something. And then God speaks and says, be quiet, listen to my son, There's Mary versus Martha, this domestic exasperation. There's Jonah, who is on a ship running from God. And what does he tell the sailors? He says, it was me. I worship the God of the land and the sea. And you can just imagine the camera panning out as they're in the midst of the sea. Really? You tried to run from this God who made the ocean? There's humor, often at the expense of characters. There's satire, often at the expense of fools, like Elijah versus the prophets of Baal, saying, "Oh, where's your God? Is he on the potty? Maybe, I don't know. Hey, God, could you?" Boom, and there's fire. There's Isaiah's famous idol satire of chapter 44 in Isaiah. He says, imagine, you will, a craftsman. He cuts down a tree. He takes half of the tree and he burns it for firewood. He takes half and he carves it into a god, and then he bows down and worships it. How silly, boom, ching, you know? You have proverbs that are mocking the sluggard, like the sluggard puts his hand in the bowl and he can't even get it out to his mouth. You know, you're supposed to laugh at that. There's irony, which is discrepancy, when the audience knows something that the characters don't, and names are a really good example of this. So you read in, I think it's 2 Samuel, or maybe it's 1 Samuel. No, I think it's 2nd, and you meet the character of Nabal, whose name means fool. And you go, oh boy, what's going to happen here? And as it turns out, he is a fool. Or you have Caiaphas in the Gospel of John, who's talking with the other Pharisees, and he says, it's better that one man should die for the people than all of us die. And John kind of inserts himself as the author here and said, by the way, Caiaphas didn't know what he was talking about, but he was talking about Jesus. Lastly, there's hyperbole, there's comic overstatement, and Jesus loved to use this kind of humor. Just the preposterous, the gigantic, the memorable, and this is where it's really funny to watch biblical scholars very seriously try to parse out the humor of what Jesus is saying. What does it mean to have a log in your own eye? And to take that out, Jesus is painting a funny picture. Hey, before you take that little speck of sawdust out, how about you remove the 2x4 out of your eye? Or a camel through the eye of a needle. I've got an example from Mark here. This is actually my translation. We've got a group of Greek geeks that are translating through the book of Mark because we're nerdy. And Jesus, I was stunned by how this actually says. So he's saying to the crowd, listen to me, all of you, and understand there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. But the things that come out of a person are what defile him. And the crowd goes, very thoughtful, Jesus. And then his disciples ask him, like, what did that mean? He said, you're also without understanding? Let me tell you. Do you not perceive that nothing that goes into a person from the outside is able to defile him? Because it does not go into his heart. It goes into his stomach and then goes out into the latrine. So he declared all foods clean. Like, the disciples, Jesus makes a reference to potty humor and says, I'm going to talk about cleanness and uncleanness here, but can we just get kind of like nitty gritty right now about what happens to food as it goes through your digestive system? It's funny. I love it. I love it. All right. Gather up with some folks around you, and what are some other examples that I didn't mention of any of these four kinds, whether it's tragedy or comedy or realism? Just do some brainstorming and see what you guys can come up with. Go. Okay, what did you come up with? Let's hear, raise your hand if you came up with some other examples that we can all hear. Yeah, in the back. Leviticus, very realistic and very, the laws in general. If you have a donkey and it falls into a pit, which is also comedy, or tragedy, I guess, if you have the donkey. Yeah, that's good. What else? Yeah. Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt, a tragedy, I think, yeah. And really, Lot's whole story is cast in that kind of tragic light. Yeah, it didn't have to be this way. Yeah. Job is a great example. Most of the book is tragedy and dealing with the questions of suffering and God's justice and all that, but then has a comedic turn at the end. Yes, good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in 1 Samuel when the Philistines take the ark and then Baal every night just falls on his face.
Yes, when the Philistines take the ark, they put it in the temple of their god, and then they wake up the next morning and the god is bowing down to the ark. Yes, absolutely. One more? Yeah, Sadie. Esther. Yeah, Esther is such a... Comedy, yeah. And I would say it's comedy and it's realism as well, because then even God is not mentioned in that story. Yeah, really good example. I love it. Okay, so for the rest of our time, we're going to talk about the three key aspects of narrative. We're reaching into the back of our brains with English class in the 11th grade and so on. Character, setting, and plot. And then we're going to have some case studies and a video at the end where we'll get to kind of put these things into practice. So let's talk about character. There are some amazing characters in the Bible, but have you ever had the feeling, are characters in the Bible even real people? They don't feel very real. When I read a modern novel, I'm hearing the inner thoughts of a character, I'm identifying with that character, how I'm like or unlike that character, and that often doesn't happen in the biblical story. Why is that? The reason is because the authors usually show rather than tell. I've got a quote here from Robert Alter. It's on your sheet. He wrote this great book, The Art of Biblical Narrative. The Greek storytelling tendency of loading the story with details is one that modern literary practice has by and large adopted and developed. That's most books we read today. Precisely for that reason, we have to adjust our habits as readers in order to bring an adequate attentiveness to the rather different narrative maneuvers characteristic of the Hebrew Bible. The underlying biblical conception of people's character is that they're unpredictable, constantly emerging from and slipping back into ambiguity. Thus, biblical narrative style is marked by the art of reticence, by which he means it shows you something rather than tells you what it is. It'll show you an example of something, and it uses characters as a vehicle for their message. And so biblical characters are not meant to be like, oh, I identify with David, I identify with Peter. Rather, they often represent how not to act, but the biblical authors are using them to communicate the morals and the ethics of how do we live with God or not live with God. And so I've put space here for you to take notes on three kinds of character development that we find in the Bible. First is direct characterization, telling. So sometimes the biblical authors do tell you things about characters. Narrators rarely make comments in the biblical narrative, and when they do, it's usually in small details or brief phrases. So sometimes you'll get a reference to a character's physical appearance. So we're told, for example, that David is kind of puny, but he's good looking. We're told that Saul is very tall. We're told that Esau is hairy. Details about physical appearance are usually only told us when it's relevant to the narrative. You'll also sometimes get moral evaluations of a character's actions, and you get this a lot in the Kings. Thus, what this king did was evil in the sight of the Lord. But by and large, the biblical authors don't really do that. For example, in the story of Isaac and Rebekah, where you have Jacob sneaking in to steal the blessing from his father, you remember that story? He dresses up like Esau because his father is blind. Nowhere in that story are you told explicitly what Jacob is doing is wrong. And yet you just see it. It shows you directly how that works. So that's how the seeing versus telling, or showing versus telling works. There's one biblical scholar named Adele Berlin. She used this example. She said, modern Western narratives is like realistic paintings, like the Mona Lisa on the left there. You see all the details, and there's paintings that are even more realistic than that, where you can see every fold of their skin. But biblical narrative is more like Impressionism, like Van Gogh, where you have a lot of little small strokes, or pointillism with little dots, and together they make up a character. And that's how the biblical authors kind of give us a trace of a character, and they let us fill in what we know. For example, Esau is hairy. That's one of the only things we know about what Esau is like. So if we can extrapolate from that, that means that we know he's pretty outdoorsy, he's kind of primitive, he behaves like an animal, he stomps into camp and he says, "Give me some of that red stuff over there," and then he sells his birthright for that. Eli, the character of Eli in 1 Samuel, is old and blind. And it's important that he's blind because later as the story goes on, we see he does not see the depravity of his sons. And so his house is punished for that. So that's direct characterization. What about indirect characterization? It shows up in a few forms. For example, the names of characters. This is indirect characterization is showing. So the names of characters often indicate their role in the story. For example, Saul means the one we asked for. Abram means father of a multitude. Israel means struggles with God. Adam means humanity, and Eve means life, and so on. I love at the beginning of Ruth, it makes me laugh every time. This is kind of black humor, but the names of Naomi's two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they mean sick person and frail. And then in the next verse, they die because they're sick and frail. I don't know why you would name your children that, but that's a name of a character is often important. And you can often Google, what's this character's name from the Hebrew or so on and so forth. You have their actions that will show you rather than tell you. So J.M. McCracken says, biblical narrators prefer to show people's character rather than tell us an evaluation of their traits. Characters are something the biblical authors tend to speak with rather than about. So instead of moralizing about a character's decisions, the biblical narrators simply show you a decision that a character made, and they have you make the decision. Think about it, meditate on it. Was this good or bad? Or I'm not really sure about that. Let's go back to the example of Moses killing an Egyptian. He sees an Egyptian beating a slave. That's bad. Moses chooses to kill the Egyptian. Was that bad? I mean, he has to run away then, so why did he do it? We don't know. Was it justice? Was it an anger problem? And of course, him running away leads him to the burning bush and all the story that happened there. So maybe it was a good thing, but maybe that was God using an evil thing for good. It makes you do that reflection rather than the biblical author simply coming and saying, now what Moses did was bad, but God was able to use it for good. The Bible expects more of you as you're reading the story. Lastly, words. So often the narrative pauses and a key character will speak and their speech reveals their character. Here's a great example from Genesis 22. So this is the famous story. It reads like a tragedy where God tells Abraham, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, go up on this mountain and sacrifice him. And so he does so without question. He takes his son and he fully expects, by the reading, to sacrifice his son. But then he says this interesting thing to the servant. He says, the boy and I will go to the mountain and we will worship and we will return. Now, the narrator doesn't say, wait, did he expect to come back? The author of Hebrews picks up on this later. And he says, hey, on a close reading of this story, Abraham says to the servant, we are both going to return. Now, was he just kind of posturing? He's not going to tell the servant, like, I'm going to go up and kill the boy and then I'm going to come back. Maybe he's just putting on a front. Or maybe the author of Hebrews says, maybe he believed that God could raise the dead. Maybe he believed that there is life after death, or God is going to do something miraculous here. Is he full of faith? Is he selling a line? It leads you to wonder. Yeah, a question here. Genesis 22. Oh, Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 is where that connection is made, yeah. I've got a very long quote here from a Bible nerd named Meyer Sternberg, who just sounds like a Bible nerd's name. It's a very long quote, but I think it's great. I think it tells us a lot. Once you realize the Bible's anti-didactic style is a narrative policy, you gain insight into the role of the aesthetic subtlety of these stories. They almost always shun extended commentary or explanation, let alone homiletics, that's sermonizing or moralizing. These authors intentionally leave gaps for the reader to puzzle over, discontinuities, indeterminacies, non sequiturs, unexplained motives, and they're fully aware of the disorienting effect this has on the readers as they try to draw lessons from the past. He goes on, biblical narrators conceal the meaning of their stories to an extent seldom equaled by any other literature in history. In day-to-day life, knowledge and information and the ability to understand the meaning of events is power. But in reading the Bible, we are constantly puzzling over the gaps in the stories, and this is strategic. Our puzzlement is an imitation of our real position in life. It exposes our ignorance about the meaning of history or our lives. Biblical stories imitate our real-life conditions of inference, as we too are daily surrounded by ambiguities, baffled and misled by appearances, reduced to piercing fragments together by trial and error of interpretation, and we're often left in the dark about the meaning of our lives to the very end. The scarcity of commentary by the biblical narrators forces us to constantly evaluate the characters' motives and the meaning of the plot as we look for clues. Here's the end. It is only by sustained effort that the reader of biblical narratives can attain to the point of view that God has possessed all along. Making sense of biblical stories is to gain a sense of being human. So if I can just summarize that long, I didn't expect you to kind of take that all in. He's saying when you read the Bible and you're confused about why did this character do that, that's what it means to be human. Like, that's our day-to-day life. Like, why did my coworker say that thing and then suddenly leave the room? Or why did my mom react that way? It's teaching us to do the same kind of thing in our human relationships, because very, very rarely in our human lives do we get a clear explanation of this thing was good and this is how it will play out. This thing was bad and this is how it will play out. Human beings are messier and harder to read than that. Okay, one last thing about character. It may sound strange to call God a character, but what I mean is that God is the only character who it continues in every moment of the biblical narrative, from the beginning to the end. And he primarily shows up in two ways in narrative. The first role that God has is he's sometimes the present or the interventionist God. So, for example, in Genesis 3, God is walking around the garden. He's talking directly with people. When the angel of the Lord comes to Hagar, Abraham's mistreated slave in the wilderness, the angel talks to her and she says, I've seen the Lord provides. God God meets Moses in a burning bush. You know, those kind of miraculous romantic stories. And what it leads characters to do is it leads them to confront the living God and their sin. Like standing before a holy God, I'm standing on holy ground. That's what it happens when you're face to face with God. But at other times in the story, God is more absent or supervisory. He takes the back seat a little bit. In stories like Joseph's story, you would think up till that point in Genesis, God has mostly talked directly to characters. But then Joseph is a conspicuous aberration. All of a sudden, God isn't speaking to him. And you think he would, that God would come down in the prison and say, don't worry, Joseph, you're going to get out of here soon. Instead, God sends dreams, and Joseph has the ability to interpret it. Or in the books of Ruth or Esther, or even many of the stories of David, God kind of takes a step back. Not to say he's absent, so don't hear me saying that God is like not there, but just that God in that moment is choosing to step back. He's supervising behind the scenes because he wants characters to figure out, oops, I'm still on Mayor Sternberg, aren't I? There we go. That's where we are. He forces characters to relate to God even when they don't know what's going on. And isn't that such a human thing either as well? So, that is character. I'm going to talk about setting here. I'm going to give you a minute to write that down because I missed the slide. We're going to turn to setting in a moment on the back here, and then we're going to pause and do some group discussion and some stretches. Pretty soon we're going to get to case studies. All right. Setting. We did character, here's setting. Simply put, settings are all about cumulative expectations and surprises. What do I mean? Biblical authors use settings as a tool to evoke memories and emotions, and they generate expectations about what could happen in the story. So, for example, mountains. Mountains in the Bible. Mountains are often a place where God meets human beings, where heaven and earth overlap, where there's some kind of encounter with God. And so when we start to read about mountains, we should expect some kind of decisive turning point or revelation. For example, the story we mentioned earlier, Genesis 22. Take your son up to the mountain and sacrifice him there. We're expecting some kind of climactic moment between Abraham and God, and that's what we get. Or God meeting his people on Mount Sinai and giving them the law. Later, prophets like Elijah return to mountains. In the Gospels, Jesus teaches on a mountain. He's transfigured on a mountain. He's crucified on a hill or a mountain. He gives the Great Commission from a mountain. And so it should be no surprise when we read in Revelation 21, the expectation there is that the new Jerusalem, God's new creation it's described as being on a high mountain, which whether or not that's literal, we can talk about that. We'll probably talk about it next week or the week after with poetic imagery. But what it means is the perfect unity of heaven and earth once again. I'm going to give some other ones just briefly, and then we'll take a pause, take a stretch break. The wilderness, often a place of testing, 40 years in the wilderness, or Jesus going out for 40 days to the wilderness. This is a place where characters have to depend on God and be transformed. The prophets imagine or interpret the wilderness as a place of renewal and return. Where does John the Baptist start his ministry, proclaiming that the Messiah is coming? It's in the wilderness where people go out to be challenged by John the Baptist, and so on and so forth. The last two I'll mention just quickly. The East. The East is where Adam and Eve leave Eden. It becomes a symbol. Anytime you see a character move east, you're anticipating it's probably not going to be a good thing, because eventually the thing to the easternmost in the biblical imagination is the city of Babylon. So Babylon is represented by the east. So if you see something like an east wind is coming, you're going, oh no, I've been looking out for that. And here's an example of how setting can subvert itself. So Egypt. Egypt starts off, obviously, in the book of Exodus as the enemy. Like it's even a bigger enemy than Babylon at this point. Egypt is the one who enslaved us and oppressed us, and God had to do this miraculous rescue. And then throughout the biblical story, bad things happen when Israel joins together or allies with Egypt. Egypt is an enemy. But what about Jesus? Jesus encounters Pharaoh not in Egypt. He encounters a Pharaoh-like figure of Herod who tries to kill all the baby boys in a town. And where does he flee to? Egypt. And we wonder, wait, so is this going to be bad? Is he going to be oppressed? No. Instead, Jesus' presence makes Egypt a place of refuge. And so that's an example of how reading it, you're set up to think, oh no, Egypt. Wait, it's a good thing. Jesus subverts that expectation. All right. Let's talk about these things. What is a character or a setting? Maybe as I've been talking, you've been thinking about an example. What's a character or a setting that you are curious about and you want to explore more? Talk to somebody around you about that. I want to make sure we have time for our case studies, so I'm going to quickly go over plot. Anybody getting horrific flashbacks from English class with this diagram up here? You are probably familiar with the basic plot structure of stories. That's not to say all stories are this way, but this is generally how it goes. You have an introduction phase where the characters are introduced, the setting. You have conflict that is introduced in the story, and oh no, things can't stay the same, things have to change, things get worse and worse, and it escalates in escalation, and then it reaches some kind of climactic where either good is going to win or bad is going to win, and then there's a resolution to that as now we enter into a new normal. That's the basic pattern of plot, and biblical stories do often follow that. I won't say too much more about that. I want to talk about narration because the Bible has different forms that the narrator speaks, and understanding this has been one of the most helpful things in my understanding of how to read biblical narrative. So there are four modes of narration. You have direct narrative. This is your basic storytelling. This is storytellers reporting events, telling us in their own voice what happened. So Abraham went here, that kind of thing. You have dramatic narrative, where the narrative zooms in or pauses, and the writers dramatize a scene as if it were a play, quoting the speeches or the dialogue of the characters and noting the surrounding context around them. So imagine that you've got the opening narration and Abraham went here. Then it zooms in and Abraham and Lot start to have this back and forth in conversation. Description is where writers describe the details of the setting or the characters of, oh, by the way, you should know that they were next to the fields of Shechem, or so on and so forth. Commentary consists of explanations by storytellers about details in the story, background information. It clarifies what the audience needs to know. You'll often get this with names, like, oh, that is why this place is named so-and-so. Now we're going to come to a case study. So if you have a sheet, I don't think I printed quite enough. I'll print more next week. If you have a sheet of these two passages, we're going to look at case study number 1. This is the story in Genesis 25 of Jacob cooking some stew, and Esau comes in from the field. All 4 of these modes of narration are found in this story. And what I want you to do with a partner or a small group is figure out where are each of those modes in this story. Some of them show up more than once, but I'll give you about 5 minutes to go and do that with a partner. Okay, how did you do? Pretty good? I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule, but here's what I put down, at least. Here's what I put down. Oh, okay. So, I think it starts up, verse 29, is kind of both direct narrative and description. The lines get blurry sometimes when you look at them for too long, but it sets up what's going on, and the narrator's telling us, once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. And then we swap to dramatic narrative. We zoom in on the action of the play, and we hear a character say, and Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." And the commentator kind of chimes in here, and therefore his name was Edom, which means red. He's the red guy from now on. And then we go back to dramatic narrative. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." And so now we get a shift to direct narrative because we don't hear Esau say, "Okay, Jacob, I swear to you my birthright now." You don't get quotation marks. Instead, you get the author describing it. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob, and so on and so forth. And at the end, another piece of commentary, thus Esau despised his birthright. You kind of get the idea of how that works? Now, why does this matter? Like, you're not going to do this with you could do this with every. And I would say maybe if you're studying a narrative passage, you're in the book of Judges, and you're like, what do I do with this passage of Scripture? It's in my morning devotionals. Maybe you do an exercise like this to kind of break it down and understand what's going on. I think that the biblical authors rely on dramatic narrative. They rely on dramatic narrative and not just the bare outline of events, because oftentimes the biblical authors want us to picture how something happened. Like, the Bible could be a pretty concise book if it was all direct narrative. David did this, then he did this, this happens, then he did that. And some biblical narratives do that. They just sweep through a story. And sometimes it'll even be like, and thus he lived for 7, like Jacob working for 7 years and then 7 more years. And it seemed light to him because he loved Rachel so much. And you're just like, wow, that was 7 years that just went by in one sentence. But oftentimes, when the biblical authors zoom in on something, they want to show us how something happened. They want us to picture it, because that's how stories work. That's what moves us. We're not moved by the bare outline of events. We're moved by picturing the action. All right. Is Tressa here by any chance? Tressa, could you do video duty for me? We are going to watch one more video here from the Bible Project. This is how to read the Bible, design patterns in biblical narrative. This is just kind of one piece that pulls everything together. After this video, we're going to do one more case study with the time we have left.
We've been exploring how biblical narratives work, and it turns out stories in the Bible are like any other story. You've got to pay attention to the characters, the setting, and the plot.
Yeah, these are the basic tools an author uses to help readers see the meaning and significance of the events. Now, it's time to learn one final skill that will bring all these elements together: how to detect design patterns in biblical narrative.
What do you mean by design patterns?
Well, the biblical authors have shaped all these elements, character, setting, and plot, to create series of repeated patterns that weave through story after story and tie them all together. When you notice these patterns, you'll see how different stories across the whole Bible have been coordinated to emphasize key themes.
This sounds interesting, but how do you know how to find a biblical pattern?
Well, biblical authors do it subtly. The best way to catch on is to watch them embed key words and images that link stories together. Take, for example, one of the main themes of the Bible, the complex and tragic human condition.
Okay.
So let's start at the beginning, where God is making a really good world.
Right, 7 times it says God saw that it was good.
So those are clearly important words. Now watch. God appoints 2 characters named Human and Life to rule this world on his behalf, and they're told that everything is good for them to eat.
Except for the tree of knowing good and evil.
So then the humans doubt God, and in Genesis we read, they see that it's good to take this knowledge for themselves. Then we read, they desire to become wise, and then finally, they take what they want.
And everything falls apart. This story is about the human condition.
And on its own, it's a really powerful story, but the biblical authors don't leave it there. They turn it into a pattern. It happens again with Abraham and Sarah. God brings them into the promised land, promises them a child. But they don't trust God, they get impatient, and we read the same words. They see their Egyptian slave, they take her and do what is good in their eyes. You get it?
Yeah, the stories match.
Then you get to Aaron at Mount Sinai, and we read how he sees and then takes the gold of the Israelites to make the golden calf. Or there's the story about Achan, who sees the gold of the Canaanites, he desires it and takes it for himself.
This pattern highlights how one person's temptation can create suffering for many people.
Exactly. It's just like the story of Saul, where we read that the Israelites see him. They desire him and take him as their king so they can be like all the other nations.
And Saul's reign leads them to destruction.
Or there's the story of David, which says that he sees Bathsheba, he desires her and then takes her and then kills her husband.
And then David's family starts destroying each other.
So you see, it's just one basic theme repeated over and over. These stories are all designed to show the temptation pattern.
Which is kind of a downer.
But the repetition builds up anticipation. Perhaps someone will come and break the pattern. This is why the stories of Jesus have been designed to carry the patterns forward to their climax.
Really?
Yeah, like what does Jesus say when he's faced with his greatest temptation to avoid dying on the cross?
Not my desire, but your desire be done.
So the pattern flips, and you have one person resisting temptation, and his suffering provides life for many.
Very cool. Can we do one more?
Totally. How about a big one? How God brings humanity through chaotic waters into a new world. It starts on page 1, where God separates these dark, chaotic waters.
Yeah, dry land emerges as a home for humans to flourish.
Then the pattern reappears with the chaotic waters of the flood. God rescues this remnant, Noah and his family, through the waters so that they can step onto dry land and become humanity 2.0. Now, does that basic storyline remind you of anything else?
Oh, right, the famous Exodus story.
Yeah, exactly. That's when God saves his chosen people from Egypt by leading them through the waters onto dry land.
While Pharaoh and his armies destroyed.
The pattern repeats later with Joshua and the Israelites.
They passed through the waters of the Jordan into the Promised Land.
Yeah, you got it. So now you can see how later biblical authors will project this pattern into the future. Like Isaiah, he hoped for a new Exodus with a new king, leading God's people forward into a new creation. And in this repetition, the nations become the chaotic waters.
So you can see how combining all of these patterns brings us to Jesus.
Yeah, notice how all the Gospels highlight that story of Jesus going to the Jordan River. He goes into the waters and back out again.
His baptism.
That's when God announces that Jesus is his son, who will rescue the world from the chaos of our evil and violence by going into death and out the other side. This is why baptism became such a big deal for Jesus' followers. It's about participating in this ancient pattern, going through the waters of death, following Jesus into the new creation.
These design patterns seem really important.
Yeah, they're actually the main way biblical authors have unified these hundreds of stories together. And every pattern develops a core theme throughout the whole biblical story that leads to Jesus.
Great. That's biblical narrative, which makes up over 40% of the Bible. Now, another 30% is made up of ancient poetry.
And learning to read biblical poetry is what we'll explore in the next videos.
And that will be next week for us. We'll talk about poetry, which makes up about a third of the Bible. Thank you, Tressa. Appreciate it. So now let's do our big case study here. This is your final exam, just kidding, on biblical narrative. This is the famous and strange little story. One of the only, well, I guess the only story we have about Jesus as a young boy. And it's found in Luke 2, so if you have your case study sheet, I want you with your group to just make observations. Given all that you know, flip back to your notes. What do you see in the plot, in the setting, in the characters? Make some observations and talk about this question. What was something new you learned by studying this passage with a new awareness of plot, character, or setting? So you don't have to understand everything. Just try and get one new thing out of it. You'll have about 10 minutes to do this, and we're going to gather back together. We'll talk about it. We'll take a few questions. All right? I'll leave this slide up there for you. Go. Okay, let's gather back together. It's a fun little story. Kind of unique in the biblical narrative. What were some new things you noticed in studying narrative in this way with plot, setting, or character? Yeah. Yes, Mary treasured up all these things in her heart, it being the exact same phrase as with the wise men, and so you get a clear pattern there. Yeah, even as Jesus is growing in wisdom and stature, Mary is too. She's learning some things along the way, which I imagine you would if your son was perfect. Robert. Yeah, Jesus dwells in the dwelling place of God and then says, what, didn't you read the whole scripture? Like, where do you find God? You find him in the temple. Of course I'm going to hang out here. This is my place. Yeah. That's deep. Yeah. So I'll restate it. So in the whole Old Testament, we're looking for the promised seed of Abraham, the promised offspring of Abraham. And in this narrative has that little detail of they looked for Jesus among their relatives, but they couldn't find him. That's subtle. I love that. That's great. Yes, so the humanity and divinity of Jesus in just those two lines. Your Father and I were looking for you. Don't you know I'm in my Father's house? Both are true. And there's maybe the realism and the romance just in those two lines. The realism of your parents who take care of you, your guardians, but my Father in heaven. Yeah. Yes, he was dead for 3 days. I didn't talk about time with setting, but this is one of those things that people have written volumes about. Time is something huge in the biblical narrative. So 40, 3, 12, Numbers, without getting weird about numbers, if you read the Bible backwards and upside down, the secret code, yeah. But 3 days, there's some significance to that. How long was Jonah in the fish? For 3 days, and Jesus says, you won't get any sign but the sign of Jonah. Yeah. And that small detail gives you a lot about Jesus' upbringing. Once a year, they took the family road trip to Jerusalem for the Passover. That was, think about your, it's obviously not the same thing, but think about your rituals and holidays growing up. I remember for the first 18 years of my life, Christmas was like this. And for Jesus, this was clearly a momentous thing of year after year. We go to Jerusalem, we tend to stay in the same spots, and then I bet for the remaining years after this one, Joseph and Mary are very much on alert, and then it becomes kind of the running joke, and just like in my family, it was, hey, you remember when Uncle Ed did that funny thing? And remember, Jesus, when you disappeared for 3 days, did you see the look on Mom's face when you told her that, why didn't you look in my father's house? I had never seen Mom turn that shade of red before, that kind of thing. Yeah, it tells us a lot. The imagination goes with this. Yeah. Anything else? Mark? Yes, the religious backgrounds. Yes. Yeah. So the religious background of, they were very devout. Not every Jew did this, of going to the Passover, and therefore, what other how did they keep the rest of the law? Did they keep the rest of the feasts? Yes, good. Maybe one more observation. Yeah, the unidealized human behavior of, we can picture ourselves being like these parents, even though just earlier in the chapter we had the whole miraculous, there's the star and of course the virgin conception and that whole thing and the angels coming, and yet very human parental reactions, and Jesus submits to his parents. He clearly didn't sin, but he listens to his parents. He does what he says. He doesn't put up a fight, and he grows in stature and wisdom. Yeah, good. Oh, yeah, one more. Yeah, so the question is, what does that mean, unidealized human behavior? So what I mean is, in some kinds of narratives, you'll have idealized humans where they almost don't seem real because they always do exactly the right thing. So it's not to say that Mary and Joseph are doing something wrong, just that they're realistic humans. We could imagine a version of this story that it wasn't reality or it wasn't what happened, but we could imagine it as if it would be Jesus went missing. Mary and Joseph, knowing full well that their son was God's son, knowing full well that he would be in the temple, went straight to the temple and worshiped, and it's like, they were human beings. Of course they would freak out a little bit. And then Mary would treasure up all these things in her heart by the end. Does that make sense? Right. Unidealized is they're not perfect. Idealized would be they have no obvious flaws or weaknesses, or they know everything. Yeah. Ruth, as we said earlier, is kind of an idealized character. And the drama of the story of Ruth is not Ruth's sin, it's the tragedy and circumstances that she's in. That's the drama of the story there. So that's not to say that she's sinless, it's just that that's not what the story is focusing on. What it's focusing on is the tragedy of her widowhood and so on. Yeah. We've got about 4 minutes here. I want to open it up for any more questions just about anything we've talked about or anything that's on your mind related to biblical narrative. What questions are coming up for you? Yes. How do we go about finding symbolism in the Bible without making it up or making it just seem what you want? We're going to talk a lot about this next week. You have a tendency, I'm noticing, to ask the questions that just perfectly set up next week. But here's the short answer. Symbolism is often repeated in the Bible, and it's often used in similar ways or in ways that are the opposite, that show the contrast or the highlight. And so the kind of the clearest way, like for example, they pulled out the design pattern of passing through the waters. Well, we have a lot of repetition of passing through the waters, and water itself is an image and a theme, and you can kind of trace it. Does it show up elsewhere is probably your first place to go. What about symbols that are a little bit more obscure, like Jacob sleeping with a rock as his pillow, and then he has a vision of angels coming up and down from heaven? That's a little bit more obscure, but you're then looking for parallels of that movement of up and down in heaven. And then you're also, New Testament commentary will often reframe or help explain what symbolism means in the Bible. So, an ordinary reader, a Jewish reader of Jonah, and they see he was in the fish for 3 days, would probably think nothing of it. But then Jesus' followers look back and they're remembering Jesus' words and said, hey, remember? Jesus said he was going to give us the sign of Jonah. How many days was he in the tomb? He was dead for 3 days. Whoa, mind blown. That kind of symbolism. Good question. We're going to talk about it a lot with poetry, everyone's favorite genre. It's my favorite. I love it, and it's going to be fun. I will see you next week. Thank you.